As we reach the end of the year, I wanted to bring on a different kind of guest. Dave Dyer isn't a Pluralsight author. He's just an IT guy working in the trenches, and like most IT folks, he struggles to work on his day-to-day job while also keeping his skills up to date and relevant. He's an operating system and application deployment specialist, currently working as a System Center Configuration Manager Administrator. He's worked in IT in one form or another, primarily focused on Microsoft technologies for more than 20 years. He spends most of his time right now attempting to streamline Configuration Manager installs and architecture for new implementations, enthusiastically working to leverage desired state configuration and other automation technologies. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hi, Don. Thanks for having me as a guest.
So I guess I want to start by getting a sense of your mental state with regard to the IT industry. Do you really worry about keeping up? Does it keep you up late at night? And if so, what specifically do you worry about? Is it that you won't be able to keep your job, or is it something else that kind of makes you think about this?
Definitely does keep me up at night. In fact, usually because I am up late trying to continue learning all the time. I guess it's a little bit of all of those things, really. It is difficult to keep up because the technology has changed faster and faster, especially with Microsoft's new dedication to faster releases with Windows 10 and even with Configuration Manager now with the new servicing model. So I spend a lot of time worrying about keeping up with that in itself, but also about what's coming next, right? So I'm always trying to figure out what skills am I going to need to be leveled up in order to, when as the companies shift to using different technologies, am I ready for it?
And so what are some of the things on your radar right now, and why are those there?
Mostly, I'm really been looking at containers. I'm excited about Windows containers and a lot of the new stuff coming with Server 2016 in general, or just Windows Server, depending on how Microsoft decides to name that when it releases. Containers and sorry, I just drew a blank there for a second.
That's okay.
That's the first thing I was thinking about, and
I guess containers is kind of interesting because that's, you've worked primarily in the Microsoft space, and we've never had containers. Containers have always kind of been a Linux thing, and people hear about Docker. So do you really see that as something that is going to change the way you do your job in some number of months or years?
Yeah, that's what I'm really trying to get my head around. I think that maybe it will. A specific case that has been on my mind is, being in kind of the client management space right now. We have to manage a lot of licensing servers for various applications that are out there. Now, because it's such a small service, it's hard to justify having one server per service. So what happens is we end up with a lot of different licensing services running on one server that sometimes are diametrically opposed or trying to live in the same space. We have port conflicts, that kind of thing. I could see where containers or even just Nano Server itself making it easier to have those things live in their own space, and then being able to tear those down and build them back up quickly as we need to.
And so I guess that really kind of shines a little bit of a light on something that's happening in IT. And I tell people that for the longest time, it feels like it must have been a decade and a half. Really, we didn't change much. We had virtualization kind of come on the scene, but really that didn't change most of our lives because we were still managing servers, whether they were real servers or virtual servers. It was kind of the same thing. But we're hitting this point now where, I mean, my goodness, Microsoft loves Linux and now has a certification running Linux on Azure. And we've got all these different ways of thinking about IT now with containerization and kind of top-level policy-based configurations, and automation in the Windows universe suddenly became a thing one day. And we're all starting to think a lot more like maybe our Linux and Unix counterparts have been thinking for a long time. And is it kind of that whole shift? And I know we probably go through this every 10 or 15 years, but we're here now. And is it that kind of whole shift that really kind of makes you feel like maybe I really need to focus on things?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely It's definitely what you're right. It's such a big change in mentality right now from what we're used to in Windows, Microsoft in general. So it really is, and it's funny that you bring up the Linux thing too. I've actually was thinking recently that wow, do I need to maybe I should start focusing on leveling up in Linux a little bit because I mean, and I've trained in it to some degree, but um, why it's looking more and more like as administrators we're going to want to not be completely focused on one side or the other. Maybe we can be a little more agnostic since they can live together in Azure.
So that's kind of interesting. I run into a ton of folks, especially in the Microsoft industry, who, for whatever reason, or good or bad, they got into this because running Windows is not that different from just using Windows on the client. I mean, they look a lot alike, they behave a lot alike. And this idea now that, gosh, I've suddenly got to become a programmer, and you're telling me I have to learn this other operating system that I'm not familiar with, and that's just not why I got into this. Do you kind of run into that attitude, whether it's people you know or colleagues or even coworkers? And if so, what do you tell them? How do you bring them around to your point of view?
Yeah, I run into that a lot. I guess it was, and I started focusing pretty heavily on like PowerShell a few years back, and uh, uh, I ran into it a lot where I was like, well, guys, why don't we focus on scripting this out rather than? But the attitude I run to a lot is like, well, I've been doing it this way forever. Why should I bother? Um, it's I can or how why don't we automate our server builds? Well, because it only takes me a half hour to get the server up and put together, and we don't make that many of them every day. Well, maybe that's true, but that doesn't mean that we can't streamline it. And also having that ability to recreate something for maybe a disaster recovery uh, situation. But I guess I digress a little bit there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of disbelief that really that it would be that important. And I always try to tell people. I think there's an article I read a few years back about why learn PowerShell. I don't it might have been Jeff Hicks that wrote it, and there's been several like that. I've read stuff that you've written along those lines as well. That really Microsoft has kind of invested their entire future in PowerShell. They're building their all their server platforms basically on top of it. So if you're not learning it, then you kind of almost don't know how to run server anymore. And you can't take advantage of these things like running in core or nano server going forward.
I tell people too that you have to be a little careful with the attitude of this is the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
There's another industry, the taxi cab industry, that has always done it that way for probably 100 years, and they're in the middle of being decimated by companies like Uber and Lyft, who are just doing it differently.
Right.
So no matter what the rules are, somebody can come along and change the rules before you realize it. So,
Definitely.
I guess the $1 million question is this: how do you keep up? If there's something out there that you want to learn, what has worked for you, and even more importantly, what hasn't? What have you tried to do to keep up that really just kind of hasn't worked?
Um, I, I haven't been a big fan of classroom learning, like going to a learning provider that has certified Microsoft trainers. There's nothing wrong with that, and some people I think need that more. But for me, it's like, well, I'm taking a week out of my job, which I oftentimes don't really have pleasure of doing. I mean, there's just too many things to keep up with. So even when I'm trying to do classroom training, a lot of times I'm having to go back and check on my work anyway. So what I found that works is really a mix of online learning. I've tried different digital services. I'm purely on Pluralsight at this point, and I'm really liking it. And what I like to do is I'll find something that I want to train in, and I'll kind of just watch the videos and try to do it organically without trying to sit down and do too much stopping the video and trying stuff out. I'll try to just watch stuff through, and then I'm a real big book learner, so I'll also find if they exist for that particular technology yet, and then really go through the book slowly and run through examples, and that's kind of my process, and it's worked pretty well for me.
Now, how much of your training materials, whether it's videos or books or something else, are provided or paid for by your employer, and how much, if any, do you kick in on your own?
Uh, Book wise, it's almost exclusively my own investment. But I did get my Pluralsight subscription paid for by my employer last year, and that's still running. I've since changed companies, so we'll see how that goes coming up next year round.
Now, one thing people tell me a lot is that they get excited about new technologies. I hear this a lot about desired state configuration, for example. They're very excited about it. They kind of see the potential, but they're sad because they won't get to use them in their environment for whatever reason. And they kind of take that as, yeah, it's a shame I'll never get to play with that, so I won't really learn it because we're not going to use it. Do you ever focus on things that aren't currently in use where you work, and how do you make the time for that if it's not part of your job?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and a good point. I mean, that a lot, almost a lot, I know a lot of the stuff that I focus on is not being used currently in my environment. Since I tend to be in the client management and deployment area, um, I have my own servers that I manage, but I'm not part of hosting. So like, I can't really say, hey guys, let's try out Hyper-V instead of VMware, or let's try out some desired state configuration, even though maybe it's not completely 100% ready yet, or whatever. Like, we could try to start building our own resources. I can say those things, and but a lot of times, like, just like we were talking about before, it's like, well, this is the way we're doing it. And there's kind of a siloed mentality too. It's like, well, we're hosting. We'll figure that out. We have our own automation methods through vSphere and things like that. So, yeah, even though I can't try it in my own job necessarily, that doesn't mean that I won't be able to use it in maybe the next job.
And sometimes it can be a struggle to play around with new things without a lab environment. You've got to have servers, you got to have clients, you've got to have the things to play with. Is that something you have at work? And do they let you play with things that aren't really applicable to work, or do you have your own personal lab environment for playing around?
I have my own personal lab environment, and I mean, it's not exactly super beefy or anything like that, but I've got my own rig with about 32 gigs of RAM, and I just, a great way to do this when you don't have that much resources is just, be on Windows 10, or for a while Windows 8, and just use Hyper-V, and you can spin up as many servers as you want and do it over and over again. It makes it's a little bit harder for doing networking if you're trying to learn that, but for server stuff.
And if you wanted to kind of inspire somebody, maybe give someone listening to this a New Year's resolution for 2016, what would you tell them?
I would say that don't assume that that things aren't going to change, like you were saying before. Like, and it really doesn't take all your time. I think a lot of people you get overwhelmed. Don't feel overwhelmed, because even if you just train a little bit at a time, and even if you're just going and trying things out to see what you're into and what you like, every little piece that you learn along the way will at least put you in a point where you can have that conversation with people about what's the next thing, and how can we use this technology. Even if it's something that hasn't come up for you yet. What if your boss comes to you and says, hey, we're trying to figure out a way to automate this? Well, if you've been at least keeping your head around these things, then you can raise your hand and say, hey, why don't we try this out?
That sounds like great advice. Dave, thanks for joining us, and I hope you have a really successful 2016.
Thank you. You do the same.